Japanese counterattack. At 1630, General Clifton B. Cates, in command of the 4th Marine Division, ordered his forces to button up for the night. Command expected a nighttime counterattack. Barbed wire, preloaded on amphibian vehicles, was strung along the front. Stockpiled ammunition could be seen in every weapon's position. Machine guns were emplaced to allow interlocking fields of fire. Target areas were assigned to mortar crews. Artillery batteries in the rear were pre-registered to hit enemy approach routes and fire illumination shells to light up the battlefield. Anti-tank 37mm guns with canister ammunition, anti-personnel shells firing large pellets for close infighting were positioned up front. This would ensure severe casualties and do the greatest damage to the enemy. The Marines dug in and waited for whatever the night would bring. The 24th Marines were backed up by the 1/8 Marines, occupying the northern half of the Crescent defense. The 25th, with a battalion of the 23rd, occupied the southern half of the Crescent. The rest of the 23rd were in reserve, along with artillery battalions from the 10th and 14th Marines, waiting in the rear on high alert. The Japanese prepared for their counterattack. Because of their shattered communication lines, it would not be a coordinated operation. Units would need to act independently. Colonel Ogata issued a general order on June 28th: destroy the enemy on beaches with one blow, especially where time prevents quick movement of forces within the island. The Japanese had 850 naval troops at the Yushi Point airfields on the Marines' northern flank. Opposite the center of the Marine lines, near Mount Lasso, were another 2 battalions of the 50th Infantry Regiment and a tank company of over 1,500 Japanese troops in total. On the west coast, facing the Marines' right flank, were another 250 men from an infantry company of the 50th Regiment, along with an anti-tank squad and an anti-tank detachment. The Japanese Mobile Counterattack Force, a 750-man battalion of the 135th Infantry Regiment, equipped with new rifles and demolition charges, waited 6 miles from the White Beaches. Japanese movement toward the northwestern beaches within the Marine lines was treacherous. All daylight movement was closely monitored by air surveillance and vulnerable to American firepower. But the battalion set out under its commander, Captain Izumi, and was hit frequently by unobserved artillery and naval gunfire. Izumi advanced and made his objective through skillful use of terrain for concealment. At 22:30, he probed the center of the Marine lines where the 224 Marines were tied in with the 3rd Battalion. According to a Marine combat correspondent, while most of the Japanese crept along forward of the lines, a 2-man reconnaissance detail climbed up on a battered building forward of the 24th Marines and audaciously jotted notes or drew sketches of the front lines. When Marines recognized this impudent gesture, they rewarded them with a thundering concentration of artillery fire. Another Marine wrote of his vivid memory that night. A big gully ran from southeast to northwest into the western edge of our area. Anyone in their right mind would have figured out that if there was going to be any counterattack, they'd come from that gully. Throughout the night, Marines reported they heard a lot of Japanese chatter from down in the gully. Then they hit us at about midnight in K Company's area. They hauled a couple of 75mm howitzers by hand with them, and when they got up to where they could fire at us, they hit us hard. I believe K Company did a damn good job, but about 200 Japs pushed through us, 1,500 yards to the beach area. Once the Japs hit the rear areas, all the artillery and machine guns started shooting like hell. Fire came in from the rear and grazed right up over our heads. During this, the enemy that hit Company L was putting up one hell of a fight about 75 yards from where I was, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it. Over in Company K's area is where the attack really developed. That was where Lieutenant McGuire and his 37mm guns on the left flank were firing canister. I watched 2 Marines manning a machine gun lay out a cone of dead Jap bodies in front of them. A dead Jap officer laid right in there with them. A combat Marine correspondent later described this action. Marines held their fire until the Japanese were less than 1,000 yards away. Then they opened up. The Japanese charged, screaming "Banzai" and firing machine guns and throwing grenades. It was near impossible for the Marines to hold on and continue firing. The next morning, we counted the Jap bodies piled in front of us. Over 250 dead Japanese soldiers. Just before sunrise, 2 tank companies showed up. They wanted to get right at the Japs and were sent off to an area held by Companies L and K. The major returned in less than 15 minutes and said, "You don't need tanks. You need undertakers. I've never seen so many dead Japs." Another large party of Japanese troops was stacked up by the 75mm howitzer guns of the 14th Marines, supported by the 50 caliber machine guns of batteries E and F. These machine guns literally tore the Japanese to pieces. Over 600 Japanese were killed in their suicidal attack on the Marine center. On the left flank, the 124 Marines came under attack at 0200 from 550 Special Naval Landing Force troops out of the barracks at the Yushi Point airfields. Company A was hit so hard it was at one point reduced to only 30 men with weapons. Company A was forced to draw reinforcements from corpsmen, engineers, communicators, and members of the shore party. Illumination flares soared over the battlefield. This allowed Marines to use 37mm canister shells, mortars, and machine gun fire to good effect. The fight continued until dawn, when medium tanks from the 4th Tank Battalion lumbered up to break up the last attacking Japanese troops. By this point, many Japanese had used their grenades to commit suicide. As the sun rose, 470 Japanese bodies were counted in the defensive crescent, mostly in front of Company A's position. The last enemy attack that night hit the right flank of the Marines at 0330. A handful of Japanese tanks rattled up from Tinian town's direction to attack the 23rd Marines' position. They were met with fierce fire from anti-tank guns, Marine artillery, small arms, and bazookas. Lieutenant Jim Lucas was a professional reporter who enlisted in the Marine Corps after the attack on Pearl Harbor and was commissioned in the field. He later wrote, "3 lead tanks broke through the wall of fire. One glowed a bloody red and turned crazily on its tracks before careening into a ditch. A second, mortally wounded, turned its machine guns on its tormentors, firing into the ditches in one last desperate effort to fight its way free. After another 100 yards, it stopped dead in its tracks. The 3rd tank frantically tried to turn around and retreat, but our boys closed in and literally blasted it apart. Bazookas knocked out a 4th tank, killing the driver. The rest of the crew piled out of the turret screaming. The 5th tank was now surrounded and tried to flee. Our bazookas made quick work of it. Another hit set it on fire, and its crew was cremated. The 6th tank was chased off by a Marine driving a jeep, but destroying these tanks did not end the fight on the right flank. Infantry from the Japanese 50th Regiment continued to attack the 223 Marines. While they were repulsed and killed in large numbers, mainly through effective use of anti-tank 37mm guns with canister shot. In the last hopeless moments of the assault, some wounded Japanese destroyed themselves by detonating a magnetic tank mine, producing a horrific blast. From a Japanese standpoint, that night's work was a disaster. Over 1,200 bodies were left on the battlefield, several hundred more carted away during the night. With fewer than 100 Marines wounded or killed, losing these Japanese troops broke the back of the already poor defenses of Tinian. Now that their communications were shattered by sustained fire from Saipan and increasing fire from Tinian, survivors were capable of only the weakest and most dazed sort of resistance. During the next 7 days, small groups of Japanese took advantage of the darkness to launch night attacks, but mostly they only withdrew in no particular order until there was nowhere left for them to withdraw. Most agreed that the battle for Tinian was over, but 4th Division Intelligence Officer Colonel Guterham McCormick, a Marine Reserve officer, later to become the mayor of Philadelphia, did not agree. We believed after the counterattack the enemy was capable of a still harder fight, and from day to day during our advance expected an even more bitter fight that never materialized. Hard work still lay ahead. A demanding task was the exhausting but straightforward job of humping through the cane fields and humidity with frequent monsoon downpours. Fearful of not only sniper fire, booby traps, and mines, but also fires that could sweep through the cane fields and incinerate anyone caught in its path.